Hi everybody, I hope you're all comfortable and ready for my presentation. So I'm Pia Sundqvist and I'm here today to talk about my research that relates to multilingual L2 English classrooms. But before I do that, I would like to begin by thanking Christy and her colleagues in the organizing committee for fixing this conference. Thanks for all your efforts. I think it's so important that we keep on moving forward despite everything that is happening. It at least gives me hope that we can actually have a conference, that it happens. You've done a great job in getting a solid program together. So again, thank you. And I feel, of course, very, very honored for having been invited as a plenary speaker. And I'd like to say that I would not be giving this talk had I not attended the National Forum up in Luleå in 2015. I ended up having lunch with 2 new people at that conference, and it turned out to be an important lunch, and I will get back to that later in my talk. I will begin my talk, which is divided into 4 parts, with a short historical overview of 60 years of teaching and learning English and other languages in Swedish schools. You will notice some changes over time, over the years. And the purpose of this background is to give a picture of what has guided and framed English language teaching in Sweden over time. It's difficult to understand today if we don't know what happened yesterday. And my overview will build on historical facts, but my commentary will be guided by some personal comments as well. I will draw on my experiences as a student in school, as a student teacher at uni, and as an English teacher in school, and of course as a researcher in the field of applied linguistics and English language education. The second part I will devote to theory and previous work, and in part 3 I will present an intervention study that was carried out in real multilingual classrooms. This intervention was so much fun, and I hope you will enjoy hearing about it. And the fourth and last part connects with the theme of the conference. So I will spend some time talking about language use and teaching practices and some implications, perhaps for English teacher education. So, 60 years of English in Swedish schools then. We have had 5 curricula in 60 years. So let's take a closer look at the development of English. So starting in 1962, English was taught from year 4 up until year 7, and then some students also took English in years 8 and 9. Back then it was a compartmentalized view of language with a focus on skills, a lot of grammar translation, drill to kill, behavioristic approach. England and the USA were the only countries mentioned. In reading, it said, some examples of American English can be used, but the default was British English and RP. It was possible to choose basic or advanced English courses. Then in 1969, English was moved down, so it started in year 3. The same type of view, planned grammar tasks with explanations in Swedish. The teacher was supposed to use a simple language, meaningful exercises, still a behavioristic approach. Lots of studios were used with so-called bunden talövning. So you had speaking exercises with error correction. Still RP, but American English should be allowed. English-speaking countries are mentioned, and some American English, still basic and advanced courses. In 1980, English was starting in grade 3 or 4 up until the 9th grade. Language in use, abilities are stressed. Oral competence, communication is emphasized, the task sequences, lots of role play, input focus on form, grammar books should be used, still quite behavioristic, Global English is mentioned, and also work life. Extramural English is in there. They didn't use the concept, but you know what's happening outside of school is mentioned. And also authentic material can be used as resources. Still RP, but American English should obviously also be allowed. And in 94, here we have a big change with a goal-oriented curriculum. That's an important change. English is moved down to start perhaps even from first grade. It's up to the school to decide. Language in use, the importance of the learner's own voice. So the learner is mentioned in the singular plural, eleven. Content becomes more important. Output, focus on form and function. Global English is in there. Work life. Depth is mentioned. Extramural English is there, although they don't use the word. IT is mentioned. More of a socio-cultural approach. Proper British English or American English pronunciation. Intercultural competence. And then in 2011, English from year 1 up until year 9. Still, you know, language in use, but it's more of a holistic view now. A focus on form and function. Core content is mentioned. Knowledge requirements, that's new. Learner voice and agency is stressed. Still English outside of school. Media is mentioned, and also information and communication technology. They talk about parts of the world where English is used. Language strategies and adapting language to recipient and situation is emphasized. So interaction is there, and intercultural competence. So from a focus on describing teaching basically, to learning and to learner agency. And we've had different grading systems, if you remember all of these. Let's move on and look at multilingualism in the curriculum. Back in 1962, Danish and Norwegian is mentioned as part of the Swedish school subject in one sentence. And then, you know, we're supposed to understand those languages. French or German. Finnish is mentioned, but only as an option if you get an okay from the above. In 1969, the language situation in the Nordic countries are mentioned in half a page. Danish and Norwegian are still there. Finnish, especially regionally, can be a language. It says that we're supposed to listen to children's literature in Finnish, in Faroese, and in Icelandic. And the role of the non-Nordic languages have in our country is stressed. French or German, and then Finnish as an option. In 1980, still the languages in the Nordic countries, half a page, Danish and Norwegian, and then some knowledge of other Nordic languages. Pronunciation rules for Finnish and Icelandic is part of the curriculum. A new subject is Swedish as a foreign language. The goal here is to join Swedish subject, and the purpose of that subject is of foreign language, Swedish as a foreign language, is to be able to participate in society and you know, get friends and so forth. Home language is also a new subject, and the goal is active bilingualism, still French or German. And mother tongue tuition has been supported since 1977 in Sweden, and that's important from an international perspective. Then in 1994, knowledge about languages in the Nordic countries, down to 8 words now. Home language is still in there, a slightly changed goal. There is talk about B and C language, so that's French and German and also Spanish now. And then there is a school and language option, and also sign language. In 2011, students are supposed to be acquainted with the Nordic languages and also with our minority languages, and that's in about 3 sentences. Swedish as a second language is now a part of the curriculum, and the goal is to develop knowledge of and about Swedish and to be able to rely on one's own language ability. Home language has become mother tongue, and the goal is, for example, identity development. And then we have sign language, and now it's called modern languages. So we have French, German, Spanish, and also other languages to choose from. And 3 important language acts happened. The Language Act from 2009 and the Education Act, and then also the resolution on multilingualism from the European Union, which Sweden signed, which promotes mother tongue plus 2 languages in education. Now, schools were supposed to get revised syllabi this year, but due to COVID, they postponed everything a year. But for English, developing multilingualism will be an explicit goal starting in July next year. You can see the quote here. And as for the other languages, as part of Swedish, we still have Danish and Norwegian, and there's one sentence also about the Nordic languages and minority languages. And we still have L2 Swedish and mother tongue and modern languages and sign language. That said, I'd like to share where I come from and what I believe or believed in. I was a teacher in school for many years, as you can see. I used a strict English-only policy in my classroom throughout my teaching career. But some glimpses from my English path. When I was a small child in 3rd grade, I was given the name Pat by my teacher in English. I loved that we got English names, and I felt sorry for my classmate Peter, who had to remain good old, Peter. So that was kind of boring. I thought he couldn't play a role. Later, when I was a student teacher, I had spent a year in high school in the US, and I remember that I was forced to use British English just to get by and pass the pronunciation test, even though American English was allowed. But that was basically, only in theory. My first job, when I was a mentor, all my students had L1 Swedish, except a few who were bilingual Finnish and Swedish speakers. My last job as a mentor, I had 11 different nationalities in my classroom and 11 languages. And as a researcher, I've learned and experienced the so-called social turn. I have also learned about the multilingual turn, but I think I'm yet to experience it in full. Which leads over to part 2 of my talk, multilingual English classrooms. And back to the National Forum in Luleå 2015 and that famous lunch. So I'm ending up sitting with 2 people from Lund, Marie Kjellqvist and Henrik Gyllstad, and then Erika Sandlund, my colleague at Karlstad, joined me. I didn't know Marie and Henrik back then, but we started talking about common questions that we got from our student teachers, such as, is it better to only speak English in the classroom? Or should I translate to Swedish, and if so, when? What should I do when there is a student who barely knows English or Swedish? How can I best help students to speak languages I don't know? So we received these questions in Lund and at Karlstad, and we had no answers. None of us were able to give, research-based answers to our students. And we sat there at the lunch and we said, hey, we have a pretty good idea for a research project here. And so a year and a half later, after that lunch, we received great news from the Swedish Research Council about our project, Multilingual Spaces. I truly hope that something similar may happen in some of the social, Zoom rooms at this year's National Forum. That would be absolutely wonderful. But our project is led by Marie Kjellqvist, and the rest of the team then is my long-time colleague Erika, and then Henrik and myself. And we decided on 3 main project aims. The first is about mapping beliefs and ideologies of multilingualism. We have done that among teachers and learners, and also among school leaders. The second aim has to do with trying to understand language practices in multilingual classrooms, when we use ethnography and lots of video for that. And the third aim is about measuring vocabulary learning in multilingual classrooms. So we have a 3-week intervention adopting what we call 3 different treatments. And instructions and resources were in English, English only, and then in English and Swedish, and in English, Swedish, and all other languages. And in my talk today, I have decided to mainly report on our findings relating to this third aim. And I want to stress that these are our findings. This is joint project work, and I just happen to be here presenting them today. So, what about language practices in multilingual classrooms? Well, we have an English-only ideal, but also an English-Swedish de facto language policy in L2 English classrooms in Sweden. We know from research that there are cognitive and social benefits of drawing on students' entire language repertoires. We also know that language minoritized students cannot exercise their entire language repertoires. We also have pedagogical translanguaging these days, and the so-called multilingual turn. From psycholinguistic research, we know that there is activation of the L1 when learning or using the L2. For example, when learners' L2 proficiency fails them, the L1 is activated. And both lexical form relatives and translation equivalents in the L1 influence L2 word processing, but this effect is lessened as a function of L2, increased L2 proficiency. And we also know that L1 concepts are activated during L2 reading, for example. And we can go on. We know that learners' agency is enhanced when reference is made to their L1 in classrooms. And we also know that teachers use the L1 even though most of the most of the interaction is in the L2. And then when it comes to vocabulary research, scholars actually recommend using L1 translation equivalents. And then that can actually be better than the use of, for example, L2 definitions and pictures. So, why interventions in multilingual L2 English classrooms? Well, it's been pointed out that there is a need for studies that actually combine experimental control with ecologically valid learning environments, so classrooms. And there are few such studies in real classrooms. You have an exception here with Busse et al. 2020. This slide shows you the results of a small comparative study we did when we compared the speaking time in English classrooms in Norway and Sweden, and these are multilingual classrooms. And of the total speaking time that was recorded with the help of audio and video, most was in English, and you see that in blue here. And then some was actually in the majority language, which was, Norwegian, yellow, and Swedish, the red slices here. And then both languages, which is indicated in green, that is when there was this rapid code switching between English and the shared majority language. What is central in this small study was that we could not observe, or we did not observe any other languages in these multilingual classrooms, and we didn't hear anything, we didn't observe it. Even though, they were multilingual classrooms. So mainly English was used. Over to part 3 of my talk. We're going to look at the intervention study. So first of all, what is a multilingual classroom? Well, we operationalized that as classrooms where we had 5 or more multilingual students. And, well, who's a multilingual student or learner? Well, we define that as learners of English who use Swedish or one or several additional languages in their everyday life. And proficiency can, of course, vary in these languages. And we recruited 4 schools from 4 municipalities in 2 different regions in Sweden. And we have lots of classes that we have observed, and 6 of them are our intervention classes, and they are indicated in bold here. 4 of these 6 classes are mainstream, but class 32 is a so-called fast track English class, and class 35 is an English CLIL class, so content and language integrated learning class, which means that in addition to English, some other school subjects were English medium instruction. We then have a lot of more information about the schools. As you can see here, we use stats from the Swedish National Agency for Education. Really no need to go into that right now, but I just want to say that we're very happy about the good mix of schools and classes that we have in this project, and what our 6 intervention classes have in common is the fact that they are multilingual classes. Right, so I will now run through the principal study design. So this is in the 9th grade, so they are 15 or 16 years old. And before the actual intervention started in grade 8, they responded to a student questionnaire with background questions. And then approximately 1 month before the intervention started, we went to the classrooms and they took a vocabulary pre-test with 60 items, and they also took a proficiency test which was multiple choice test with 32 items. The actual intervention lasted 3 weeks in each class. At the end of each project week, they took a vocabulary immediate post test, and they were tested on 20 items each week. And then 1 week after the intervention, they filled out another questionnaire, which basically was an evaluation. What did you think about this intervention or the experiment that you were part of? And finally, we returned after 8 to 10 weeks after the intervention, and then they took the delayed vocabulary post-test, the same 60 items. And as I said in the beginning, the aim was to test 3 different treatments in the classrooms. So we introduced the students to what we called rules of engagement. So the teacher stuck to these rules at all times, and the students tried to do so as well to the best of their ability. And we were 2 researchers in each classroom during the intervention. So one was a guest teacher, and the other was responsible for the video recordings and everything. And the regular English teacher of the class was also present at all times, helping out with attendance, for example. So the rules of engagement were in treatment A. We called it treatment A with the students. That was to try to stick to English only. So that was a monolingual approach, coded blue. And then treatment B was to try to stick to English mainly, but please feel free to use Swedish for support. So that's a bilingual approach, coded green. And then treatment C was, try to stick to English mainly, but feel free to use Swedish or any other language for support. So that's a multilingual approach, and that was coded yellow. The teaching materials, we used a textbook in English from Norway. We selected texts under a theme called Freedom, and we complemented those with authentic texts. So we had texts 1, 2, and 3 for each project week. And in week 1, it was about Martin Luther King. And in project week 2, the text was about Nelson Mandela and South Africa. And in project week 3, it was about the author Nadine Gordimer and one of her texts, fiction. And we had a pilot study before the intervention in which we identified vocabulary that we could use. So we had 60 words in total, and 36 of those were very difficult words and 24 were easy. And we had to modify the text. For example, we shortened them and we had to add some of these difficult words. We know that these texts have the same difficulty level, and we used Flesch Reading Ease score to compare the texts. And we had a similar structure for the 2 lessons each project week. Each week we had 110 minutes of teaching. So lesson 1 was always an introduction to the theme or the text that week. And then we had listening and plenum teaching, followed by activities for the students where the purpose was to learn the vocabulary, the words. They knew that. So they worked, for example, with word cards and matching. Those were compulsory tasks. And then in lesson 2, we always started with the Kahoot, which they enjoyed, where they got to rehearse and practice the target vocabulary. And then they kept working with their activities, and we had many more choices in addition to those compulsory ones or mandatory ones. And then at the end of the second lesson, all students took what we called a quiz, and that was the immediate post-test. And we also added 3 reading comprehension questions in that quiz. And we had color-coded all the teaching materials, so they, in blue, green or yellow depending on the treatment, and they had student folders with the materials. And these rules of engagement cards, we put those on the desks to remind the students of the treatment this week, and also it reminded us what was actually at play. And activities, handouts, and so forth. To give you an idea of how difficult the words were, you just look at these 3 lists, please. You see the 12 target items for each week that they were supposed to learn. And you have the frequency bands listed here. For example, so the first word, sullen, is from the 8,000 level, for example, K8. And this means, the means in the table show you that the words tested each week were at a similar level of difficulty. So in total then, 36 difficult words were supposed to be learned. And we prepared scripts for teaching. We were 2 guest teachers. We tried, to teach in as similar as we could, even though we're different personalities, of course. I happened to be one of those who did the teaching. We had read and listen manuscripts for the texts, which, for example, told us when to stop the recording, and we asked questions, and we highlighted target vocabulary and so forth in a similar way across all the 6 classrooms. And the teaching materials, they had these activity handouts where they recorded what they had done, whom they had been working with, and this was also in line with the treatment. So for treatment A here to the left, everything is in English, as you can see, whereas in treatment B, it's in English and also in Swedish. And the word lists, here you see one to the left you have treatment A, English only, so you have the target word and then an English explanation. And to the right you see English and Swedish, so you have the English word and then a translation equivalent in Swedish, sorry. And then interesting for treatment C, we had to contact professional translators to help us with the different word lists in all these different languages that were represented in the classrooms. And I think we had something like 32 different languages amongst all, the sample. And all students got, all these lists in the multilingual treatment, and many thought it was really interesting to see the word in all these different languages. We used counterbalancing to control the order of teaching or the treatments in the 6 intervention classes. We are trying to combine, ecological validity and experimental control. It's very challenging to trying to control all variables, but we did our best to do so. So in total then 330 minutes of teaching across all 3 weeks. And as an example here, if you look at class 23 here in the table, they had English and Swedish the first week, and that was followed by English only in the second week, and then English, Swedish and all other languages in the third week. And in contrast, for example, class 44 at the bottom row, they started with English, Swedish and all other languages in the first week, and then they had English and Swedish and ended it all with English only. So I hope you get an idea of this counterbalancing design and what we try to accomplish in terms of controlling for the order of treatment. So how did we test the words? Well, we were interested in what's called meaning recall. So the students were given the form, and then they were supposed to recall the meaning of the target word. They could supply a definition, use an L1 translation, even drawings, as long as they demonstrated, recalling the meaning of the word that we tested. And those students who answered in a language that we had no knowledge of, and some individual students used that answering option quite frequently. And for those, then we got help to correct their answers. And here is a sample answer from the immediate post-test 1 from a girl. She was born in Sweden, but grew up as a Swedish-Kurdish bilingual. And as you can see here, the word form is given, for example, to beat. So she ticks this option, I think I know this word, and she answers in Swedish perfectly fine, att slå. And then for to release, she ticks that she knows, she thinks she knows that word, and she gives an English explanation, which is perfectly fine. Whereas for the word sully, okay, I don't know this word, so she ticks that and leaves it blank. Here's another sample answer from a newly arrived boy from Syria, whose age of onset of Swedish was age 13, and his first language was Arabic. And he made use of, a drawing here to answer the question about sullen. He thinks he knows, the meaning of that word. To judge, he says, I think I know what this means, and answers in Arabic. And then for the word rob, he writes in Swedish att stjäla. And to ensure, high reliability when it comes to the scoring, each item was corrected and coded jointly by 2 of us researchers. So each tested word was scored 2, 1 or 0 points. And we also coded each student's response mode of each target word. So basically it could be, a word in Swedish, English or another language, or an explanation in Swedish, English or another language, or a drawing or other. So 8 options. And then when I will present the results, I will talk about gain scores. And just to explain quickly what we mean by that, the gain score could, for example, be here, I'll just go for the example. I think you'll get it. If you scored, for example, 9 points at the pre-test, a student, and then 19 points at the immediate post-test, then the gain score is 10. And we are interested in the gain score means for the classes and also for language background groups. And from these 6 intervention classes then in the 9th grade, in total we had 127 students who participated, and we have all data from 74 of them. Nothing is missing for 74 of them. So the results we present are based on these 74 students. So over to the results then. Our first research question: what is the effect of monolingual, bilingual and multilingual vocabulary learning intervention treatments on students' vocabulary learning outcomes? We used mixed effects modeling to analyze our data, which makes it possible to take random variation between classes and groups into account. And Henrik, he's definitely our expert here, so all credit to him for this specific part of our analytical work. Our model showed, and this is for the immediate post-test gain scores, our model showed that there were interactions for treatment and class, and to tease out the differences within classes for treatments, we created what's called these interaction plots for treatment and class, which you can see on this slide. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with statistics, the stars indicate significant differences, which means we can rule out chance. So if you please look at the three of the classes, class 12, 35 and 44 here, they all scored lower for the English only condition compared to the English and Swedish. Classes 35 and 44 also scored lower for English only compared to English, Swedish and all other languages. Whereas for class 12, this difference was less pronounced. Classes 21, 23 and 32, they had quite similar profiles with slightly higher levels for the English and Swedish condition. I will move on to the delayed post-test, which was, as I said, after 8 to 10 weeks, so quite a long time. We see here that we have much lower gain scores. It's illustrated in this figure. As interaction effects were observed again, interaction plots were created for class and treatment for the delayed post-test. So now you can look at classes 12, 32 and 35. They had similar profiles, scoring slightly higher for the English and Swedish condition compared to the English only and English, Swedish and all other languages. Class 21 had a low and flat profile across all conditions. And then class 23, they had a slanting profile with higher scores for English only and descending for English and Swedish, and even further so for English, Swedish and all other languages. Finally, class 44 had a profile going in the opposite direction, with higher scores for English, Swedish and all other languages, and then falling for English and Swedish and English only respectively. And this reminds us of their profile in the immediate post-test. I move on to research question 2. So what are the effects of language background? So we took our sample and divided the learners into groups based on their language background profiles, the questionnaire that they had answered. So the bilingual group is the largest one, and that's the orange slice here of the pie, 51% of them, or 38 students. They are learners with Swedish and a heritage language from birth. The multilingual group was the smallest, 23%, or 17 students, the grey pie slice. They are learners with a late arrival of onset of Swedish. 9 years old was the mean. And then the Swedish L1 group, blue, they had Swedish from birth, but no heritage language. Before I show you the findings on the test for them, I will show you how they answered these questions, because we coded those answers based on the language background groups, and we will look at well, you can see here that the dominating answer mode in all three groups based on language background, that was actually to translate into Swedish, and that's the light blue bars here. And then if you check the option for drawing, we find it in the multilingual group, and only about 2% of all answers were drawings, but some use this option frequently, and the students whose sample answer I showed you before, he was one of those who did that a lot. Now, let's look at the immediate post-test gain scores based on the language background groups. How did it go? Well, for the bilingual group to the left here in the picture, there was a significant difference. It existed between English only and English and Swedish, and also for English only versus English, Swedish, and all other languages, but not between English and Swedish and English and Swedish and all other languages. Then, if you look at the right-hand side of the picture, this is for the Swedish L1 group. There was a significant difference for English only versus English and Swedish, and also for English only versus English, Swedish, and all other languages. However, for the multilingual group, no differences were observed. And you can see that it's kind of flat. Research question 3 asks, what are the effects of English proficiency level and school subject grades in English and Swedish? So here there was a strong, significant correlation between English grades and the aggregated gain scores. So all conditions, immediate and delayed post-test, both of them. So English grades was a factor for vocabulary learning. Swedish grades were not. And I should also add that the proficiency test that they took was strongly correlated with the English grades. So we used English grades as a measure of proficiency, English proficiency. So I will now sum up some of the important findings for you. Regarding research question 1, the effect of mono, bi or multilingual treatments on vocabulary. Well, gain scores for the English-only condition were almost exclusively the lowest. You may also remember that 3 out of 6 classes had what we call flat profiles, and then 3 classes had better results on the bilingual English and Swedish and multilingual English, Swedish, all other languages conditions. How do we explain these findings then? Well, we would like to argue that yes, translation equivalents are helpful as quick mapping of form and meaning in vocabulary learning. There was no effect of the order of treatments. The results linked to treatments can possibly be a reflection of the teaching practices that the students were used to with a regular teacher. That's a possibility. It's clear that the influence of Swedish, is important. Swedish is important as a strong community majority language and also a school language. And then the fact that there were so low scores for the delayed post-test overall probably has to do with lack of repetition. After an intensive exposure for 2 lessons over just a few days, and then it took 8 weeks or so. Vocabulary research has shown that repetition is crucial. So for the students in our intervention, it was more like massed than spaced learning, and spaced learning is better with repetition over a longer period of time. For the results, when we divided our sample into language background groups, research question 2, we found that L1 Swedish learners and learners with a bilingual background had significantly higher scores on the English and Swedish and the English, Swedish and all other languages treatments compared with the English-only condition. The multilingual group, where students have a late Swedish age of onset, they showed no significant differences across conditions or treatments, but they had higher scores on the English-only condition compared with the other two groups. And how do we explain this then? Well, the multilingual, it's noticeable that the multilingual group had an even performance, and they were better on the English-only condition than the other groups were. And it seems clear that the Swedish and bilingual groups benefited from their strong Swedish skills. Our third research question asked about the effects of English proficiency level measured with the English grades, and then the school subject grades in English and Swedish. And for covariates, English grades were a significant predictor both for immediate and delayed post-tests for classes and the immediate post-test for language background groups. English proficiency is a significant factor for gain scores. There is a Matthew effect. The rich get richer and the poor gets poorer. That is, learners with large vocabularies, they are, better at acquiring new words than those with smaller vocabularies. It's easier. Conclusions then, there is weak support for an English-only approach. Translation equivalents, they are efficient for vocabulary learning. This fast form meaning, mapping is important. We find support for pedagogical translanguaging, and there is this Matthew effect that I just talked about for vocabulary learning. Spaced repetition of vocabulary is important for retention. That leads up to the last part of my talk, part 4, reconsidering language use and teaching practices. If we want to avoid students like the one you see here in higher education as well as in classrooms, in schools, it's absolutely necessary for all of us involved in educating future teachers of English to think twice about what we say and teach about language use in general when we are together with students, and what we teach about language use in English classrooms in particular. Some concerns. I think teacher awareness about students' language backgrounds is very important. I would like to emphasize that encouraging L1 use in additional language learning works for many, but not for all. This has been shown in linguistic ethnography from English secondary schools in Norway also, for example. We have seen it in our project too. For example, that these trilingual word lists, they only work for students who can actually read and write in their first language. And that's not always the case for multilingual students. We should also think twice about teaching practices. The Doug-Lafleur Group 2016 formulates a number of aims in the framework they propose, and I will get back to that in a minute. Their third aim is to develop practical, innovative and sustainable solutions that are responsive to the challenges of language teaching and learning in our increasingly networked, technologized and mobile worlds. I could barely say that. That was a long quote, sorry. Here are my concerns. They are related to extramural English. An implication is that teachers in higher education need to acknowledge and encourage students' extramural English engagement. I have argued a lot for this to happen with English teachers, among English teachers in school, but it's not limited to them. It needs to be also in higher education. And I think we should use bridging activities in our teaching, as suggested by Thorne and Reinhardt 2008. Bridging activities have to do with teachers facilitating L2 learning through, for example, students bringing texts that are relevant to them into the classroom. And I mean text in the broad sense. And the teacher takes it from there, so to speak. Raising language awareness, talking about, the differences between formal and informal English. There's a lot about such implications also in our motivational practice book. My next slide is a very long quote, so please be prepared. You can skim this while I breathe a little bit. Yeah, now you probably have read it all. So, I agree with Lourdes Ortega in her quote here. I'll move on with the Douglas Fir Group 2016. I'm sure everybody who is into applied linguistics and language learning and teaching as myself know the contents of this seminal paper. Or you know parts of it. It's an awfully long paper, but they were 15 authors, and I guess they had a lot to say. And they talk about, and I quote here, the need to design a more encompassing integrative framework for understanding and doing SLA that would speak to both language teachers and researchers, end of quote. And I will close my talk today by citing some of the aims of the Douglas Fir Group framework and offer my comments and questions in the hope that they may inspire you to continue, discussing these topics at your respective institutions. And even though this paper is in the broad field of applied linguistics and SLA, I think it's relevant to all of you in my audience, regardless of your English discipline. I suggest you first skim the first aim of the Douglas Fir Group now, and I will pose 3 questions from this aim. First, what are the fundamental understandings of English language learning and teaching in a Swedish context among those of us who are involved in higher education? And second, how do we understand linguistic development in an additional language, in our case English? And third, what forces beyond individual learners do we need to consider? And the second aim is, to promote the development of innovative research agendas for SLA in the 21st century. And please look at that beautiful Douglas fir in the photo here on the slide. Again, I have a few questions for you to consider. First, what innovative research agendas for SLA will you perhaps discuss over lunch at this conference or in one of the Zoom rooms? The second question, what innovative research agendas may there be for English literature and linguistics? And what innovative research could transcend traditional disciplinary barriers we have in, English literature, English linguistics, and English education or didactics? That would be interesting to discuss, I think. Finally, the fourth aim of this group has to do with improved communication with our audiences, with our stakeholders. In your area of research, what is your wide range of audience, and how can communication be improved? And which stakeholders benefit from your research and how? These are questions with implications that we need to address, I think, as researchers. Before I end, I would like to take this opportunity to promote one of the outputs from our project that I think might be a welcome tool for many of you as researchers and probably for your students who might be writing their masters or other papers. So in response to our first aim of the Multilingual Spaces project, we have developed and validated what we call the Multibap questionnaire. This questionnaire measures teachers' beliefs and practices about multilingualism relating here to learning of English then. It's in press and it will be published open access and also on our project website. We ended up with 6 factors and 33 items for teacher beliefs in our scale, and you can see them here, the 6 factors, and you can just please contact me if you're curious about this. And we collected data from 139 English teachers in Sweden, and when we developed this instrument, and it's a representative sample of English teachers in Sweden. We're currently working on that paper, but I can show you right now what they answered when we asked them to fully agree or disagree with the statement, "Students learn English best if they stick to English only during English lessons." So this question has to do with their beliefs about an English-only approach, if that's optimal, for learning. And this figure reveals that teachers' beliefs, they clearly, vary. Most of them lean towards the agree side, which, I'm not surprised. We believe in English only, many of us. So this appears to be a fairly strong belief amongst English teachers in Sweden. Now we're at the National Forum 2021 at Södertörn, and I'm back to those 4 questions that we received from our student teachers that we discussed at that famous lunch 6 years ago. And how will I answer these questions today after this project? Well, is it better to only speak English in the classroom? Is it better? Well, not really. There is weak support from this research, and I used to do that for 15 years in school. But there is weak support. Should I translate to Swedish, and if so, when? If deemed necessary for comprehension for the individual learner, I think we can translate. If moving on is important, to speed up the process, then right then and there, it might be good to give them a translation real quick. I never did that. And sometimes, it stopped learners from learning, I think, maybe, in hindsight. What should I do when there is a student who barely knows English or Swedish? Well, in answer to that question, perhaps encourage the use of L1 then, especially for low proficiency multilingual learners struggling in both Swedish and English. And how can I best help students who speak languages I don't know? Provide dictionaries, L1, English, Swedish. Acknowledge awareness of learner language background. Perhaps sometimes pair up students with peers who speak the same first language, if that's possible and suitable. That might be a good idea. I'm not saying, we should of course speak English as much as we can, but perhaps being very strict about English only is not the way to go all the time. I guess that's what I have learned. Finally, here's a new project. It's called STAGE. It has to do with starting age and extramural English and learning English in and outside of school in Norway and Flanders. In addition to looking at starting age for formal English instruction, and we saw in my introduction that the starting age has varied, in different curricula when we start with formal instruction. But we will look at that in extramural English, and language background will definitely be an important variable that we examine in this project. And that's something that I have learned over the last 4 and 5 years. And all of my Multilingual Spaces colleagues are with me in this project, and a few more people from Norway and Belgium, Flanders. And I would now just like to say thank you for listening, and I want to thank Martin Lindqvist who has been helping me with this recording and with editing. And I will be happy now to answer any questions you might have in Zoom.